Leaked U.S. intelligence and a U.S. admiral are admitting that China is building a World War-sized navy. And just what does it mean for Xi Jinping's ambitions on Taiwan, and how can the U.S. keep up? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. So this is a compilation of a few stories, but most notably, a recent statement in front of the the Senate Armed Services Committee, by the head of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, Admiral John Aquilino. And Admiral Aquilino is Aquilino. Listen, man, I can't pronounce anything correctly, okay? Cut me a break. But the important thing to take away is not whether or not you roll the Q here. It's that he is warning the Senate Armed Services Committee that China's People's Liberation Army Navy, the plan, continues its aggressive military buildup and modernization efforts, right? And some U.S. intelligence indicates that Xi Jinping wants to be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027. The admiral continues that the PLA's actions indicate their ability to meet Xi's preferred timeline to unify Taiwan with mainland China by force if directed, right? So right now, in 2024, China couldn't take the island of Taiwan. They don't think they have the military capacity to do so, right? So it's not really on the table. But by 2027, it will be. And that is worrisome, of course, for not just the United States, but for the globe at large, right? China, despite massive economic issues, like a really large collapsing real estate sector that is essentially the wealth vehicle for the average Chinese citizen, right? It is sort of their 2008. China is still increasing its defense budget by almost 10% this year. And the third year in a row that China has boosted that budget. So China may be looking at World War II, not just in terms of how to scale its shipbuilding, but in terms of how to float its faltering economy, right? We've seen in World War II, right, the U.S. had a decade of the Great Depression that had decimated the private industry. And thanks to huge government expenditures in the Second World War, that was able to bring back the U.S. economy. It's a little more complicated than that, right? The fact that the rest of the world had their industries destroyed, meaning there was literally no competition for the U.S., and the fact that the markets, right, that Japan and Europe had demand, but literally no ability to supply, also sort of helped the U.S. economy come back after World War II. But again, the scary thing is that could also be part of China's plan to sustain through a large wartime type expenditure, then destroy key industries like, for example, chip manufacturing. Then you take advantage of the fact that much of the world is economically crippled, or that large portions of the world now can no longer get key goods, and then make a bunch of money selling those goods to the parties in the conflict, right? And of course, the admiral says that he thinks that they're actually spending more on defense than they articulate. This is a classic Chinese move of sort of fudging the numbers around a lot of economic data, and they would have an incentive to obscure just how much they're spending on defense. And what is more interesting, or more worrisome perhaps, right, is that the only time we've seen this scale of development of a navy is the Second World War, right? That is the last time we've seen any country engage in this scale of military buildup. And it's pretty worrying, and it's most troubling because it's not just the PLA's Navy. They're building capacities in the air with new aircraft and aircraft carriers. They're building capacities in space. They're building the ability to attack internet and cyber infrastructure, and even engage information domains is code for propaganda. So right now, Chinese propaganda is pretty cringe and pretty bad, right? The Russians are quite sophisticated, but the Chinese are not. But they're learning very quickly. And thanks to things like AI language models, right, China can create convincing propaganda without sounding like a badly translated Chinese movie, right? It's in the last 3 years. In fact, China's added more than 400 fighter aircraft and 20 warships to its arsenal and doubled its missile inventory, which is pretty insane. At the same time, Beijing doubling the number of satellites it fields, increasing by 50% and doubling its nuclear arsenal, right? And the fact is, China is okay. Let's talk for a minute about the scale of this, but then why the U.S. is at such a crossroads in its own military. Okay, so here's one more article. This is actually from October, and it was pulled from the Pentagon's annual report on China's military development. Right, the Pentagon calls it a pacing challenge, meaning that China is escalating its ability to do things and the U.S. military struggling to keep up, right? There's a few troubling trends, especially around the Navy, right? This is where this is most obvious. Beijing obviously can put way more ships in water than the United States. China's continually outpaced the U.S. in shipbuilding capacities and shipyard capability, right? For example, the declassified report from the Office of Naval Intelligence estimates that China has 232 times the shipbuilding capability of the United States. That's because China manufactures basically all of global civilian shipping. But if you can build a civilian ship, it's not that hard to convert it into a warship and a warship factory, right? So in the last 12 months, of course, Beijing's Navy increased in size by 30 ships, right? The U.S. Navy, by contrast, has grown by just 2 ships in the last year, right? The plan is, of course, around 370 ships, making it the largest Navy in the world, whereas the U.S. has a combat fleet of about 291. Now, the thing to take away, though, as the U.S. will often tell you, or at least the major defense contractors will tell you, that a PLA Navy ship is just not equivalent to a U.S. ship, right? Of those 30 new ships, 15 were modern surface combat ships, but the other 15 presumably were either out-of-date ships or like dual-purpose kind of reserve line naval vessels. But this is the stark reality that no one really wants to talk about. And that is that Ukraine has and should have taught the planners at a lot of militaries that war is different, right? So in World War II, here's an example, right? To use another World War II example. The U.S., basically in the Pacific theater, the Japanese took out the battleship, and the battleship was, for most navies, considered the best of the best. That was the flagship of the fleet, its most powerful and devastating weapon. And what shocked people about Pearl Harbor was not just that it was a surprise and a failure of U.S. intelligence, but that Japan was able to use these cheap little technological machines, these airplanes, right? Because remember, after World War I, aircraft were, even during World War I, aircraft were kind of a gee-whiz nifty thing that sometimes provided ancillary support. But to see these aircraft, these cheap little pieces of aluminum with an engine strapped to them, sink the flagship, the mightiest weapons in the entire fleet, right, was shocking. And a $10,000 or $100,000 aircraft were sinking the equivalent of multi-$100 million battleships. That was the shock. That was the shock. The other shock, the true shock of Pearl Harbor. Now, the U.S. figured this out. They said, listen, in World War II, you're right. We are going to take these ships and we're going to find ways to take these cheap, very effective pieces of equipment, these airplanes, and we are going to put them on a ship and we're going to use those to sink the Japanese Navy. That's how we're going to defeat the Japanese Empire. And we did, right? And the problem is that the U.S. took the wrong lesson for that. What they took, they said, aircraft carriers are unstoppable. And now the U.S. has something like 24 aircraft carriers in the water, right? Super carriers capable of carrying massive, super advanced aircraft that are able to do things that boggle the mind, right? Especially compared to like their World War II predecessors. The problem is that now those aircraft, They are the battleships, right? And the question that someone like China is asking is, how do we sink an aircraft carrier? Because here's the problem, right? When you look at US aircraft carriers, right, they take a long time to build, 5 to 7 years, guys, right? It takes a so long, right? And that's an issue, right? Because how long does it take to build a, let's say, a missile, right? Like an anti-ship missile, the kind that the Houthis recently tested against the U.S. Warships in the Red Sea. Now, the Houthis are firing 1 or 2 at a time, right? But what happens if you're someone like China, right? And you fire 100 anti-ship cruise missiles? Because remember, if you take out that aircraft carrier, it will be half a decade before a sister ship gets fielded. And that's not to include the aircraft complement, right? And when you ask, how much does an F-35 cost? Well, buddy, it's $100 million an aircraft. And it gets even worse when you ask these F-35s that are going to be on these carriers, right? Time to build is also a long time, right? It's around 40,000 man hours, but they can knock out a new one every 4 days. But again, they aren't able to do it at scale, right? And frankly, one every 4 days means that you can only produce about less than 100 a year. So if you can sink 30 of them on an aircraft carrier, right? Do you see how quickly each of these carriers carry 60 aircraft? So that means 6 months of production more. So you could literally not see replacement aircraft for 6 months, and you won't see another carrier for 5 years. If you can take out one super carrier with, again, can China field 100 anti-ship cruise missiles? Do you think U.S. air defenses can stop that? No. And here's the other thing, right? And this is what Ukraine has found that's what every military has seen in Ukraine, is that super tanks, super elite special forces, super advanced fighter aircraft and attack helicopters, all of them are irrelevant on that battlefield. None of those fighters get anywhere close to the front lines because of air defenses, right? They fire glide bombs where they just sort of send them off and go away, right? We haven't seen any attack helicopters on the battlefield, full stop. Some of them do behind the lines transport. That's what the helicopter's role is now. And so every time the US military fixates on super advanced megatech that is so hard to replace, right? And it's so hard to replace now when the US can purchase chips from anywhere in the world. What if a key chip maker, let's say Taiwan, was to be blockaded by the Chinese Navy? Well, now you definitely can't get replacement parts. Oh, and let's say China was to embargo the US, right? Where are you going to get your raw materials, right? What percentage of steel is made in China? What about advanced ceramics? And so you see how the fact that the Chinese understand that the war of the future is going to be about quantity, right? And the US still believes that by buying more gee-whiz, overpriced, high-tech nonsense is going to somehow offset a 250 times advantage to China in manufacturing ships. Let's say one Chinese ship is worth a tenth of a U.S. warship on average. Well, that means China would still out-manufacture the U.S. by 25 to 1, okay? Even if they're producing ships that are 1/3 the quality. And so the problem is that if you are someone like Lockheed, if you are someone like Boeing, right? These high-tech, whiz super weapons are cash cows. They make so much money. And no one wants to sit there and tell them, listen, you have to find a way to get us a fighter aircraft for $5 million. You have to find a way, and you got to be able to manufacture 1,000 of them a year, right? Not 80 of them. And if you tell them, hey, listen, you've got to find a way, we can't have these super carriers. You need to find a way to come up with a naval drone. Look at how many expensive Russian warships have been taken out by Ukrainians who basically just load speedboats with explosives and a little remote control. That's it. Those Ukrainian ship drones cost like $10,000, guys. If you sold a new car, you could manufacture one of those. That's how inexpensive they are. And the Russian fleet can't stop them. The Russian warships were the most advanced navies in the entire world, cannot stop $10,000 drones that cost less than a new car. And the US is just burying its head in the sand. And it's going to have to learn the hard way that they've got to take these warnings seriously. Again, is anyone in Congress, is anyone in the Pentagon going to actually tell Lockheed Martin, listen, we're terminating your F-35 contract. We're going to open new bids for a cheap plane that can do 40% of what an F-35 can do. But you've got to be able to make 10 times as many in a given year, right? You've got to ask that question of ships too. You got to say, listen, we don't need another super carrier in 5 years. We need 10 combat vessels. We need 1,000 naval drones for the same cost, and we need them in the next 2 years. And someone could do it. You can build a cheap naval drone in a shipyard, right? Or you don't need a shipyard to build a cheap naval drone. If you provide the incentives, the U.S. will figure out a way to do it. This is still this is the country of Google and Uber and DoorDash, right? This is the country that invented some of the biggest technological revolutions in the entire 21st century. This is the country that developed the iPhone. If we put our minds to it, we could build a quantity-focused military that would terrify any of our enemies, but we don't. Right? This is about making defense contractors money. This is about building gee-whiz, super techno nonsense that generals just love. And nobody wants to admit the truth that war has changed and the U.S. military has to change with it if they want to stay competitive with someone like China. Anyway, guys, the only other thing I wanted to shout out, right? YouTube has been cracking down like heavily on my content. I've had basically of my last 4 videos, 2 of them have been demonetized. And the reason I think is actually because it's an election year and YouTube is committed to combating disinformation, which means that basically certain topics can only really be covered by like mainstream recognized news sources. And I kind of understand it, but it still is frustrating because there are videos I want to make that I know I can't. So if you want to support me and keep me able to do what I do, you want to check out combatvetnews.com. Not only do I drop videos twice a week for members, but any one of these tiers gets you access to those videos. Even if you really appreciate what I do, become a lieutenant tier or a colonel tier. I appreciate those guys so much. It gets you access to an exclusive room on the Discord. But again, this is support that means a lot to me. And those exclusive videos, they're on Combat Vet News. They can't get demonetized because I host the site. They're exclusive analysis of combat footage from wars all across the globe, from Gaza, which is a topic I can't talk about here on YouTube, from Sudan, and of course from Ukraine. So please become a member if you can. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate all you guys that have. A huge thank you to all the members of combatvetnews.com, our colonel tier members, our lieutenant tier members. Really, you guys enable me and the team to continue to do this. Thank you so much. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.